Hello and welcome to the business interview here on France 24. I'm Markus Karlsson. Today we're turning an eye to Russia as an investment destination. Is it an investor's sweet spot or a cobweb of bureaucracy and corruption? It follows the election of Vladimir Putin in the Russian presidential election. The opposition is crying foul and international observers say that the election was skewed in Putin's favor. To help us understand the money angle of this story, we're joined now by Ronald Freeman on the line from London. He's a board member of the Russian steel company Severstal. He's also an advisor at the Russian investment bank Troika Dialogue. Thanks very much indeed, Mr. Freeman, for speaking to us.
Good morning.
Now, just to get a snapshot of what you think, how would you characterize the Russian economy at this stage?
It has, of course, still very much concentrated its exports and its overall growth mechanism on oil and gas and metals. Its efforts to diversify have been mainly focused on the domestic sector. There's been very little diversification externally. So oil prices and gas prices and overall economic health of their primary customers for oil and gas are still the main drivers of the Russian economy as a whole. But the very rapid growth, not visible from outside of Russia, the very rapid growth of the consumer sector, a tremendous explosion in the number of stores that are being built in a variety of consumer sectors, has also added 15 to 16% per year of growth within the consumer sector, which has also been part of the economic picture. Overall, Russia will grow in real GDP terms about 4% this year, and much of that will be driven by continued high growth in the consumer sector.
It sounds as if you're saying that, yes, there is a lot of trouble spots, but overall, there's also a lot of opportunities.
Well, the opportunity comes from the fact that Russia's middle class is growing in number, and they are shopping. They are shopping domestically in Russian stores. They're buying Russian goods, whether it's food or pharmaceuticals or clothing, electronic appliances. Russia's industry oriented towards consumers is growing at double-digit rates, but it's still primarily domestically oriented.
Now, Vladimir Putin he's set to return to the presidency. The current prime minister, there's been a lot of chatter about that. But if we look away at the issue of the transparency in the recent election, how do you think that Vladimir Putin's election will influence the investment climate? Will it have an effect at all?
The principal objectors to his election have been mainly in Moscow. I've traveled all over Russia. He has a great deal of support outside of Moscow. Russians appreciate the fact that he has brought stability to their lives, that the ruble has been stable, that the financial sector has been stable, that the embarrassments of the Yeltsin years of having a leader who was publicly intoxicated in his trips abroad, that those years are over. His heavy-handed approach, his authoritarianism, while the growing middle class increasingly objects to it, is still well accepted by the Russian population as a whole, and the approval polls before and after the election continue to reflect that.
But as you say, though, yes, we are seeing a growing middle class in Russia, and a lot of them are in Moscow, and a lot of them are having more and more reservations about Vladimir Putin. Are you saying then that that's something that investors don't have to care about at this stage?
Well, I wouldn't say that. Investors from outside Russia who are portfolio investors will be looking at a stock market still dominated by oil companies and metal companies, and to a certain degree, electric utilities. These companies all sell at steep discounts to comparable companies in more developed markets. So those who are worried about the inherent political uncertainties of the Russian government setup, the market is telling them that we're offering you a discounted price if you're willing to take that risk on, and some of them are doing so.
Now, the OECD, one of many other organizations which have claimed or who have called for a more business-friendly climate in Russia, do you think that Putin will be a good news story when it comes to the business climate in Russia? Will he set the reforms in place, or will he increase the pace of reforms?
I think that the story that needs to be told more clearly is that while there are lots of issues on the legal side and regulatory side, in the financial sector per se, the Central Bank of Russia, the Ministry of Finance, and the major Russian banks have improved their professionalism and their ability to deal with economic challenges tremendously over the last 20 years in which I've been working in Russia. The stock market itself, the merger between the two main Russian stock markets, has been accomplished both as a legal matter and as a technical matter. So the financial sector is in good shape. And that, for portfolio investors, is a very important aspect of their investment decision. With respect to legal uncertainties, these are matters for the today and for the future. But as I say, the market prices tend to reflect the fact that those risks are still there to a certain degree.
You refer there to legal uncertainties, and corruption remains an issue in Russia. According to Transparency International, Russia ranks number 143 in the world when it comes to the perception of corruption. What can the government do when it comes to specifically that question? A lot of people are accusing the Putin administration or Vladimir Putin of only making matters worse.
I think we could certainly say there's a great deal of room for improvement. As a first matter, some of the most visible distortions of what we would consider to be due process might be addressed by this government. If, for example, President Putin were to offer an amnesty to Mikhail Borisovich Khodorkovsky, to say, Mr. Khodorkovsky, you have paid for your crimes, you have suffered, and now I will amnesty you, you return to your family, I think that would be regarded by foreign investors as a very positive step. I think also the dreadful publicity around the murder of Sergei Magnitsky, a young Russian lawyer who was held in prison until he died without ever being tried. If the parties who were really responsible for that miscarriage of justice were made to pay for their crime, that too would have a very positive effect on the way foreign investors look at Russia. And that might well be within President Putin's powers now that he's newly reelected.
I want to go back to an issue that you mentioned just a few minutes ago. You said that Russia still has a high dependence on oil and gas. The Russian government has said for many years now that it's trying to really decrease that dependence and diversify the Russian economy. At the moment, it seems as if they're going in the wrong direction, that the Russian government is very much dependent still on oil and gas and high oil prices more than anything. What specific steps can the Russian government take when it comes to diversifying the economy?
Well, they've diversified the economy domestically. The comments I made earlier about the consumer sector are a certain sign of diversification, but you don't see it abroad. You don't see Russian consumer goods going outside of Russia's borders, at least not yet. Russia still has a very low level of automobile ownership. Carlos Ghosn, the president of Renault-Nissan, has said that Russia is the most exciting car market in the world. And indeed, Renault is now present in Russia, as are a number of other automobile manufacturers. So we might see growth in those areas of motor vehicles. But Russia is now the largest producer in the world of oil, larger than Saudi Arabia. They produce now 10.6 million barrels a day. That's a very tall economic mountain. To challenge that requires huge amounts of investment in other sectors. And for that, foreign direct investment must be forthcoming. And for that foreign direct investment to come in, there has to be more easiness in the minds of potential investors about the overall legal, regulatory, and political climate than is the case today.
But what other sectors do you think that the government and international investors should be eyeing at this stage? You've spoken there about the automotive industry. Any other sectors?
Well, for example, Russia is a country of pipelines. Although there's great domestic pipeline capacity, there is a range of technological progress made in pipelines that could be invested in Russia. It could be a contribution of technological know-how that could be helpful to Russia, make the pipeline system a more efficient one. That's a derivative of the oil sector and a derivative of the steel sector, but it does count as a measure of significant diversification in a large scale. That's one area. Another area would be the Russian airline sector. The airline manufacturers in Russia, Ilyushin in particular, have made great progress in the quality of airplanes that they're able to manufacture. They also make good helicopters. That too could be a growth area, both for the domestic and export market of Russia. Finally, heavy trucks. One of the biggest truck manufacturers in the world, Kamaz, is located in Tatarstan in the center of Russia. As their products become increasingly competitive with products from foreign manufacturers because they produce at a lower price, they too could be a strong area for economic diversification on the large scale, both domestically and internationally.
Just very briefly towards the end, the Eurozone, it seems as if it is heading for a recession in 2012. How do you think that will impact the Russian economy, if at all?
That will be hurtful to the Russian economy. Europe is Russia's main customer for oil and gas exports. And if the economic recession, which we all expect this year and next in Europe, really does manifest itself, that will soften oil prices. Softening oil prices will have an immediate direct effect on Russia's government budget and provide a difficult challenge for President Putin to carry out his election promises. On the other hand, Russia's balance sheet is very low in indebtedness, far lower than anyone in Europe. I think they're about 35% of GDP. So they could borrow if oil prices soften, and I think the market would willingly lend to them large amounts of capital for long term. So they could still fill the gap, and they have the debt capacity to do it.
All right, some cautious optimism there by the sounds of it. Ronald Freeman, thanks very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us here for the business interview.
Very welcome.
And with that, we're going to wrap up the program as well. Thanks for watching France 24.